How does the tech that runs our world really work? We break it down to its fundamental truths. This is First Principles.
You're sitting at a cafe. You pull out your phone. With a few taps, you pull up a map of the entire planet, find the fastest route to a friend's house, and see a live satellite view of their street. You message that friend a high-resolution photo you just took, and it arrives on the other side of the country in an instant. Then you pay for your coffee, not with cash or a card, but by simply holding your phone near a reader. All of this is powered by a device that fits in your palm, runs on a small battery, and does it all without breaking a sweat. It feels completely normal, effortless, magical if you really stop to think about it. We are surrounded by this magic every single day. It's not just in our phones. It's in our watches that monitor our heartbeats. It's in our cars that can park themselves. It's in our laptops, our televisions, our coffee makers, our washing machines. A hidden intelligence, a tiny ghost in the machine, running the show from behind the scenes. We call it a chip, a processor. A microchip. We use these words interchangeably, but they point to the same black box, a small, flat, black square with little metal legs that serves as the brain for virtually every piece of technology we own. And we've come to accept this as the natural state of things. Of course, a computer fits in your pocket. Of course, a camera can instantly identify faces. Of course, you can talk to a small speaker in your kitchen and have it play any song ever recorded. We rarely, if ever, stop to ask the most fundamental question. How? How did we get here? How did we manage to take the power of a machine that once filled an entire room and shrink it down to something smaller than a fingernail? It seems like a gradual process, a slow and steady march of progress. But what if it wasn't? What if this entire revolution, the entire digital world as we know it, hinges on a single, astonishingly simple idea? Welcome to First Principles, the podcast where we deconstruct the complex, invisible systems that run our world to find the simple, irreducible truths at their core. Today, we are opening one of the most important black boxes ever created, the microchip. We're going to journey back in time to a world without smartphones or laptops, to a time when the word computer meant something very, very different. And we're going to uncover the story of the one foundational concept that allowed us to build an entire city of logic on a single grain of sand. To truly understand the miracle of the microchip, we first have to appreciate the world it replaced. We have to understand the problem it was built to solve. Today, we associate electronics with being small, sleek, and cool to the touch. But for the first half of the 20th century, electronics were the exact opposite. They were huge, they were fragile, and they were hot. So hot, in fact, that they could heat a room. The beating heart of every radio, every television, and every early computer was a device called the vacuum tube. Imagine a small, delicate light bulb with intricate metal filaments glowing red-hot inside a glass bulb, from which all the air has been sucked out. This little device could do something incredible. It could act as a switch. It could either block the flow of electricity or let it pass through, off or on, 0 or 1. This simple binary function is the absolute bedrock of all digital computing. Every single thing your phone does, from displaying a photo to connecting to Wi-Fi, is, at its most fundamental level, just an impossibly complex series of these on-off switches flicking at unimaginable speeds. So, vacuum tubes were the original switches. And to build a computer, you needed a lot of them. The ENIAC, one of the first general-purpose electronic computers, was completed in 1946. It was a monster. It was 100 feet long, filled 1,800 square feet of floor space, and weighed 30 tons. And to perform its calculations, it used nearly 18,000 vacuum tubes. Every day, on average, a handful of these tubes would burn out, like old light bulbs. A team of engineers had to be on constant standby, running around with shopping carts full of replacements, just to keep the machine running for a few hours. This machine, this behemoth, had less computing power than the cheap musical greeting card you bought for your nephew last year. This was the state of electronics. To make a machine more powerful, you had to add more switches, more vacuum tubes. But every tube you added made the machine bigger, heavier, more expensive, more power-hungry, and more likely to break down. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a fundamental roadblock. Engineers called it the tyranny of numbers. The sheer quantity of individual components was becoming impossible to manage. You couldn't build a truly complex computer because it would be the size of a building and would fail every few seconds. How could you ever dream of putting a computer on a rocket to guide it to the moon, let alone in someone's home? The dream of powerful personal electronics was physically impossible. The path forward was a dead end. Then, in 1947, a breakthrough. 3 scientists at Bell Labs, John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, invented something that would change the world forever: the transistor. The transistor did the same job as a vacuum tube. It was a switch. It could turn a current on or off. But it did so in a completely different way. Instead of using a hot, glowing filament in a glass vacuum, it used the weird, almost magical properties of a special class of materials called semiconductors. Materials like germanium, or most importantly, silicon. The transistor was a revolution. It was tiny, about the size of a pencil eraser at first, but with the potential to be much smaller. It used a tiny fraction of the power of a vacuum tube. It was solid, no moving parts, no fragile glass, so it was incredibly reliable. It could be switched on and off millions of times per second without ever wearing out. This was the first domino to fall in the quest for miniaturization. The era of the hot, fragile vacuum tube was over. The solid-state era had begun. You might think this was it. Problem solved. Just replace all the big, clunky vacuum tubes with tiny, reliable transistors, and you can build smaller, better computers. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. Computers started to shrink, from filling a whole room to just filling a few large cabinets. But the tyranny of numbers hadn't been defeated. It had just changed its form. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to build a massive, intricate city out of Lego bricks. The vacuum tubes were like giant hollow glass bricks that were incredibly fragile and took up a ton of space. The invention of the transistor was like someone inventing the modern, tiny, solid plastic Lego brick. It was a huge improvement. You could build things that were much smaller and more durable. But you still had to build the city by hand. Every single brick had to be manually connected to every other brick. In the world of electronics, this meant that every transistor, every resistor, every capacitor, all the individual components of a circuit had to be manufactured separately and then painstakingly wired together by hand, one by one, with a soldering iron. For a complex circuit, this meant thousands upon thousands of components and a dizzying, nightmarish web of wires connecting them all. A single bad solder joint, a single misplaced wire, and the entire thing would fail. The problem was no longer the components themselves, it was the connections between them. The wiring was the new tyrant. By the mid-1950s, engineers were once again hitting a wall. They could imagine building incredibly powerful computers for missile guidance systems or telephone exchanges, but they couldn't physically assemble them. The complexity was too great. The dream of a computer that could fit on a desk, let alone in your pocket, was still just that, a dream. Something fundamental had to change. The world didn't just need a smaller brick, it needed a whole new way of building the city. This is where our story splits, and two brilliant minds, working half a country apart, begin racing toward the same revolutionary idea. It's the summer of 1958 in Dallas, Texas. The sprawling new semiconductor facility at Texas Instruments is mostly empty. The company had instituted a mass vacation, shutting down the factory for a couple of weeks. But one man didn't get the memo, or perhaps chose to ignore it. His name was Jack Kilby. Kilby was a new hire. He was a tall, quiet, unassuming man, not yet eligible for vacation time. So while his colleagues were away, he had the entire lab to himself, and he was wrestling with the tyranny of numbers. He saw the beautiful, tiny transistors his company was making, and then he saw the messy, tangled, rat's nests of wires required to connect them. It was, in his own words, a mess. The manufacturing process was absurdly inefficient. You'd have one team of specialists growing pure semiconductor crystals, another team slicing them into wafers, another etching the transistors, and then a final team of workers painstakingly soldering these tiny components onto a circuit board. It was in this quiet, empty laboratory that Kilby had the thought that would change everything. It was a thought born of elegant laziness, the kind of insight that seems obvious only in retrospect. He looked at all the different components of a circuit, the transistors, the resistors, which resist the flow of electricity, and the capacitors, which store it. They were all made of different materials and manufactured separately. But he wondered, what if they didn't have to be? What if you could make all of the components out of the same single block of material, a semiconductor, like germanium? He knew from his physics background that you could shape a piece of semiconductor to make it act like a resistor. You could alter it to make it act like a capacitor. And of course, you already made transistors out of it. The idea was radical. Instead of assembling a circuit from a pile of separate parts, you could sculpt the entire circuit, all of its pieces, from a single monolithic block. It was a monolithic idea. His bosses were skeptical. The conventional wisdom was that you had to use the best possible material for each individual component. Using a semiconductor for everything would lead to a clunky, inefficient circuit, but they let him try. Kilby got to work. He took a tiny sliver of germanium, about the size of a paperclip, and began meticulously carving and shaping it. He created a transistor, a resistor, and a capacitor, all on this one little chip, but he still hadn't solved the wiring problem. To connect these sculpted components, he had to painstakingly solder tiny, delicate gold wires by hand, creating what looked like little arches and bridges on the surface of his chip. It was ugly. It was clumsy. On September 12, 1958, he was ready. He gathered a few of his bosses in the lab. He hooked his strange-looking contraption up to an oscilloscope, a device that displays an electrical signal as a wave on a screen. He flipped a switch. A perfect clean sine wave appeared on the screen. It worked. The jumble of components and hand-laid wires had successfully generated a signal. It was the world's first integrated circuit. He had proven that it was possible to make an entire electronic circuit out of a single piece of material. Jack Kilby had proven the principle. He had built the first city block where all the buildings were carved from the same single piece of bedrock. But it was a rough draft. Those tiny hand-soldered gold wires were a problem. His invention couldn't be mass-produced. To truly defeat the tyranny of numbers, you needed a way to manufacture millions of these circuits cheaply and reliably. Kilby had opened the door, but someone else would have to figure out how to build the factory on the other side. That someone was working in a brand new company in a place that was just beginning to be known as Silicon Valley. His name was Robert Noyce. Noyce was, in many ways, the polar opposite of Jack Kilby. He wasn't a quiet loner. He was a charismatic, brilliant, and driven leader. He was one of the co-founders of Fairchild Semiconductor, a legendary startup formed by a group of 8 brilliant young engineers who had defected from the lab of William Shockley, one of the inventors of the transistor. They were known as the Traitorous Eight. At Fairchild, Noyce was wrestling with the very same problem Kilby was, the tyranny of the connecting wires. But he was coming at it from a different angle. Fairchild had developed a crucial new technique for making transistors. Instead of Kilby's method of carving up a block of semiconductor, Fairchild had perfected a way to build transistors up in layers on top of a flat silicon wafer. They would grow a thin, protective layer of silicon dioxide, which is essentially glass, on top of the wafer. This layer acted as an insulator. Then they could use a photographic process to etch tiny, precise windows in that insulating layer, allowing them to introduce impurities and build the transistor's structures from the top down. This process was called the planar process, and it was revolutionary. It meant they could create hundreds of perfect identical transistors all at once on a single circular wafer of silicon. It was a huge leap forward in manufacturing. But then, these hundreds of transistors had to be cut apart from the wafer and, you guessed it, wired together by hand. They were right back where they started, facing that same tangled web of wires. In early 1959, just a few months after Kilby's demonstration, Noyce had his own moment of insight. It was his aha moment. The final piece of the puzzle. He was staring at one of these silicon wafers, with its grid of hundreds of perfectly formed transistors, all protected under that layer of glass-like silicon dioxide. He thought about Kilby's monolithic idea of making all the components from the same block. He realized he could do that with Fairchild's planar process. He could easily create transistors, resistors, and capacitors side by side on the same piece of silicon. But then he had the thought that Kilby had missed, the thought that would truly enable the modern world. He looked at that insulating layer of silicon dioxide that covered the entire wafer. That layer was protecting the components, but it was also a barrier. What if it could be a foundation? What if, after building all the components on the silicon wafer, you could then deposit a thin layer of metal, like aluminum, over the entire surface right on top of that insulating layer? And then, this was the genius part, what if you used the same photoetching technique you used to make the transistors to carve away all the unwanted metal, leaving behind a perfect, tiny flat pattern of metallic wires that connected all the components below? The connections wouldn't be clumsy gold wires soldered on by hand. They would be an integral part of the manufacturing process itself. They would be printed onto the chip. This was the complete solution. This was the first principle that unlocks everything. The idea of not just making the components from a single block of silicon, but also printing the connections between them in the very same process. It was a complete, unified, integrated system. Let's go back to our city analogy. Jack Kilby, had figured out how to carve all the buildings for a city block out of a single giant piece of stone. It was a breakthrough. But you still had to go in afterward and manually lay down all the roads and pipes to connect them. Robert Noyce, using his planar process, figured out how to not only create the buildings, but also to print the roads, the sidewalks, the power lines, and the water mains directly onto the surface of the stone in one elegant automated step. This was the idea that made mass production possible. You could design a complex circuit once, create a photographic mask of it, and then use that mask to print millions of identical, perfect, fully wired circuits onto silicon wafers. It was efficient, it was cheap, and it was incredibly reliable. The tyranny of numbers was finally definitively broken. Both the components and the connections were now integrated into a single, monolithic whole. The integrated circuit, as we know it today, was born. There was, of course, a patent battle. Both Kilby and Noyce had independently conceived of the core monolithic idea. In the end, Kilby was awarded the patent for the initial invention of the integrated circuit, and Noyce was awarded the patent for the specific planar process with the integrated connections that made it practical and manufacturable. Both men are rightly considered the coinventors of the microchip. Kilby would go on to win the Nobel Prize for his part in the invention. Noyce, who passed away in 1990, would almost certainly have shared it with him. The impact of their invention was not immediate, but it was world-changing. At first, integrated circuits were expensive and could only hold a few transistors. One of the first major customers was the U.S. government, specifically NASA. For the Apollo program, they needed a guidance computer that was small, lightweight, and absolutely reliable. The traditional method of hand-wiring components was out of the question. It would be too heavy and too likely to fail from the vibrations of launch. The Apollo guidance computer became the first major project to be built using integrated circuits. Each one contained just a few logic gates, a handful of transistors. But they were a revelation. They allowed engineers to build a powerful computer that weighed only 70 pounds and could guide a spacecraft to the moon and back. It was the Microchip's killer app. It proved the technology worked, and it kick-started the industry. As the manufacturing process improved, the cost of integrated circuits plummeted while their complexity skyrocketed. Engineers figured out how to shrink the transistors and wires, packing more and more of them onto a single chip. In 1965, Gordon Moore, another co-founder of Fairchild and later of Intel, observed that the number of transistors on a chip seemed to be doubling approximately every 2 years. This observation became known as Moore's Law, and it has served as the driving metronome of the digital revolution for over half a century. The first pocket calculators came out in the early 1970s, powered by a single microchip, and they made the engineer's slide rule obsolete overnight. In 1971, Intel released the first microprocessor, the 4004. It was the first time that all the parts of a computer's central processing unit, the brains of the operation, were combined onto a single chip. This was the invention that would lead directly to the personal computer. From there, the story accelerates into the world we know. More powerful microprocessors led to the Apple II and the IBM PC. Specialized chips led to video game consoles like the Atari 2600. The continued doubling of transistor counts, as predicted by Moore's Law, gave us laptops, the internet, digital cameras, and eventually the smartphone in your pocket, which contains a chip with not thousands, not millions, but billions of transistors, billions of switches, all interconnected, printed on a sliver of silicon smaller than your thumbnail. Every time you use your phone, you are holding a direct descendant of the ideas of Jack Kilby and Robert Noyce. That seamless, magical experience is the result of their victory over the tyranny of numbers. The ability to shrink a city of logic down to the size of a grain of sand. So where have we been? We started with the magic of the modern world, a supercomputer in your pocket, an invisible intelligence in all of our devices. We took that for granted. It just seemed like the way things are. But then we stepped back into a world of giant, hot, unreliable computers run by fragile vacuum tubes. We saw how the first great leap forward, the invention of the transistor, solved one problem, but left an even bigger one in its place. The tyranny of numbers, the impossible complexity of wiring everything together by hand. And that's where we found the first principle. The core, foundational truth of the microchip isn't just about making things small. It is the monolithic idea, the revolutionary insight that you could create an entire electronic circuit, not just the components, but the wires connecting them too, out of a single, unified piece of silicon. It was Jack Kilby's lonely summer project that proved it was possible, and it was Robert Noyce's elegant vision of printing the wires that made it practical and scalable. This one idea is what separates the modern world from everything that came before. It wasn't a gradual improvement. It was a phase shift. It was a conceptual leap that allowed us to stop building electronics piece by painful piece and start manufacturing complexity itself. Understanding this doesn't just demystify the chip in your phone. It teaches us something profound about innovation. The greatest breakthroughs often don't come from inventing a new thing. They come from inventing a new process, a new way of thinking about how the pieces relate to the whole. Kilby and Noyce didn't just invent a new component, they invented a new way of building. The next time you tap on your phone, or ask your smart speaker a question, or watch your car navigate with GPS, take a moment to think about that tiny sliver of etched silicon at its heart. It's not just a piece of technology. It's a monument to an idea. It is a city, with billions of inhabitants, all working in perfect concert, printed on a canvas of purified sand.
You've been listening to First Principles. Until next time, stay curious.